14 weeks, here we are at the Civil War, and this is what much of this semester has been building up toward, and so here it is, the four most momentous years in American history. So of course, I urge you to read the chapter very carefully. It's a really difficult chapter, certainly difficult as an historian to write, and this is where I think Foner is at his best. For me as an historian reading this textbook, it's like watching Michael Jordan shoot hoops. It's like watching Alex Ovechkin or Sidney Crosby play hockey. I mean, Foner is at his best here, and this is where he made his mark. His most important book was probably his book on Reconstruction, and his specialty is the Civil War era and the Reconstruction era. And so he's really masterful here in this very fraught subject, because of course the Civil War is and always will be very controversial in American history, and you have lots of people who are Civil War buffs, who know everything about the kind of bullets that different units used, and what Robert E. Lee's horse ate on the day of Gettysburg, like all kinds of stuff like that professional historians don't really know and don't really focus on. But Foner is really good at seeing the big picture, and the way he writes his history is going to be very different than the kind of history you might have read 20 or 30 years ago, or certainly 50 or 100 years ago, because the way we write history has changed. Traditionally, if you were to read a history of a war, the Civil War or any other war, you would focus on the military, the generals and the strategy, and who went where and what flanking maneuver was used at what time, and so forth. And there would be almost a blow-by-blow account of each battle, and sort of assessing where the different armies were at different points in time. And you see very little of that in this chapter. And that's because the field of history has changed, because the readership of history has changed, and our interests in history have changed. Because people want to know more about what's going on during wartime than just what the generals were doing and where the armies happen to be at a given time. We want to know about the society. We want to know about the home front. We want to know about the larger effects of the war. And that's what you get in this chapter. You get the battles, you get the turning points, you get the key decisions that were made in terms of the war, but you also get the larger social impact and the economic impact, and some of the social divisions on both sides that were going on. So you have a better sense of what's happening in the country at large during the war. And because this is the Civil War, there are a lot of myths that have kind of grown up over the last 150 years as people have talked about and studied and shared stories about the war. And so a lot of what Foner's doing is subtly undermining or puncturing those myths, sort of point by point. And he's not going to do it blatantly, but there's sort of an undercurrent. And that's what I want to talk about in our short video today. Some of the different myths that he punctures in each of the different chapters, or each of the different sections of the chapter. So he has six sections. The first is called The First Modern War. And that subtitle right there is an argument in itself, right? Because many people have argued that the World War I was the first modern war, or they'll point to different ones. And in American history, it really makes sense to call the Civil War the first modern war, because as Foner points out, this is really the first war there where the soldiers, the armies, are using the tools of the Industrial Revolution, and what that does is it makes killing much more efficient, right? I mean, that's what all good technology does. It just makes it easier to kill the other guy, and they do. They kill each other in unprecedented numbers. But it's interesting because in this section he kind of lays out the context of the war in terms of the armies, the two combatants, and the tasks that lay ahead for them. And one of the myths that he is challenging here is this idea that the South faced overwhelming odds. This is sort of a myth that it was very powerful in Southern culture. This idea that they were a besieged minority fighting the greatest power on earth. A lot of that had to do with wanting to claim the mantle of 1776. Right, they wanted to be the revolutionaries fighting the tyrannical North that represented sort of King George in England from the Revolutionary era, and certainly there are a lot of numbers to back that up. Right, in terms of economic output and population and resources available to the North was far more powerful. But as Foner points out, the North had a far greater task. Right, it's always more difficult to invade and conquer a country than to defend your homeland. The United States sees that in Vietnam, as well as Iraq and other places, right? That if you are trying to go in and conquer, that is a much more difficult task than simply holding on and waiting till the other side gives up and goes home. And that's basically the South's strategy, is a defensive strategy. Almost the entire war takes place on Southern soil. And their idea is if we can just withstand this assault, if we can just hold on long enough, eventually the North is going to give up and go home. But Foner wants to emphasize that this was very difficult. So it was no cakewalk for the North, despite the huge advantages and resources. The second section is about emancipation, and again, this is different than what you might have read decades before in terms of a story of the Civil War. Emancipation might have been played down, but Foner really wants to put this at the center of the struggle, and in part he's reacting to a myth that has come up in the years really since the Civil Rights Movement. This idea that the Emancipation Proclamation really didn't do anything. Lincoln wasn't the great emancipator. That the Emancipation Proclamation actually didn't free any slaves at all, which is technically true, right? Because it freed all the slaves that were in rebel hands at that time. So basically, in all the areas that the Union didn't control, those slaves were free. Well, of course, if the Union's not in control, how are those slaves going to be free? And so it's really true that no slaves were freed by the proclamation itself. But we shouldn't take that to mean that the Emancipation Proclamation was unimportant or just symbolic. I mean, it was a powerful document that really changed the shape of the war. It changed the course of the war in many ways, because it turned this war into a much larger fight for freedom, universal freedom, and so what you see is, for example, England, which was considering recognizing the Confederacy diplomatically and sort of acknowledging that the Confederacy was a new country in the fall of 1862, it backs off because there's no way it's going to side with the slaveholding society in a fight about freedom, right? And so by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln is really embracing this idea that Black Americans had been advocating for since the beginning of the war. This idea that this is a war about freedom. It's not just a war to keep the Union together. This is a war about freedom, and the only way that this war is going to end is with slavery's destruction. So it's incredibly powerful document, and in some ways it's one of the key turning points of the war. So Foner really wants to emphasize the importance of that document and the importance of emancipation itself and what it does for the Union Army. I mean, the Emancipation Proclamation, after that, the Union Army starts bringing in black soldiers, and this really tips the odds in the Union's favor, because now you have tens of thousands of new recruits who are not only joining the Union ranks, but many of them are running away from the South in order to do so. So it's a double blow against the Confederacy, because they're losing their workforce and the Union is gaining soldiers. So that's another myth that he wants to puncture, is this idea that the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't very important. The third section, he calls the Second American Revolution, right? And again, that's another argument in itself, because he wants to argue here that what happens during the course of these 4 years is a revolution in itself, internally. It's not just a battle between North and South, but it's actually a revolutionary war that changes American society forever. And one of the myths that he wants to challenge here is this idea that the Civil War was everything, that the battles were everything. That was all that was going on during these years. And of course, there's no question that the war consumed Americans' attention. But there were lots of other things that were going on, things that actually had very powerful long-term impact. Because what happens is that when the Southerners secede, you basically take this huge conservative bloc out of the Congress and the Senate, and so there's basically free reign for the Republicans to implement their vision. So you have a whole slew of laws that are passed while the Southerners are absent, and so and the Republicans are able to advance an agenda that had been stymied for a long time by Southern opposition, and so you get the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act. You get things that opening up the West, and much more expansive national government involvement in the economy and in supporting westward expansion. You also see that even as the war is going on in the South, the Union Army, there's still elements of the Union Army that are out west fighting with the Native Americans out there, and so you see that everything else didn't stop when the war was going on. There were other things going on as well. Moving on to section 4, where he focuses on the Confederate Nation. Here again, he wants to puncture this myth, this idea that there was a white South that was solidly in favor of the Confederacy, and that just wasn't true. There were a lot of divisions. There were class divisions. There was a lot of desertion in the Southern ranks. As time goes on, it becomes harder and harder for the Confederate government to find troops. Going after deserters becomes a huge expense and time-consuming activity for the Confederate government, but they had to do it, right? And so the South is conflicted, just the way the North is conflicted. There's a lot of conflict and dissension going on in the North, people questioning the war and so forth, but that's happening in the South too. And of course, it's understandable, because most of the destruction is happening on the Southern side, but just about all of it is, and proportionally, Southerners are losing a tremendous number of people. And so it's a really destructive war, and the South is, over time, getting increasingly frustrated and angry with the progress of the war. In section 5, he talks about turning points. Of course, Vicksburg and Gettysburg happening right at the beginning of July 1863. These two battles are extraordinarily important for the North. But he wants to emphasize that even though the North won those battles in July 1863, that didn't mean the war was over. Right, that in early 1864 things looked bad for the North, and people weren't sure that the North was going to win, and for a time it looked like Abraham Lincoln might not even win re-election in 1864. So to keep in mind that the war goes on because the Southerners aren't giving up fighting. They didn't give up after Vicksburg and Gettysburg. They're continuing to fight, and it's really only in 1864 that the tide changes for good. And finally, we get to section 6, the rehearsals for Reconstruction and the end of the war. And this is important because he talks about some of the experiments. People kind of assume that Reconstruction only begins after the war, and it's largely true that's when the large scale Reconstruction happens. But you see some experiments in the Sea Islands and in Mississippi on Jefferson Davis's plantation, where Congress and the President are trying out different ideas about what's the South going to look like if the Union wins the war. So again, read this chapter carefully for extra credit, and I want you to really do these extra credit questions very thoroughly, as you do with the other homework questions. I want you to look at the title of this chapter. Foner calls it A New Birth of Freedom. So explain where that term comes from and why Foner chooses it for this chapter. And also, do you think that's a fair description? Okay, so look at that title, A New Birth of Freedom. Why does Foner choose that term for this chapter? And do you think it's a fair description of this era? I'll see you in class.